I was walking home late for my shift at the diner. It was well past midnight, and the city had that eerie quiet that only comes when everyone sensible is already tucked away in bed. My apartment wasn't too far, just a few blocks. But those blocks felt longer when the streets were empty and the streetlights cast long shadows that played tricks on the eyes. I walked quickly with my head down, focused on getting home without any surprises. About halfway through my walk, I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eye. I froze with my heart skipping a beat. But when I looked over, I saw it was just a dog. A big scruffy mutt with a coat that looked like it hadn't been brushed in a while, and eyes that seemed oddly gentle for a stray. He trotted up to me with his tail wagging, looking at me with this friendly expression like he'd been waiting for me. "Hey there, buddy," I said softly, reaching out to pat his head. He leaned into my hand, letting me scratch behind his ears, and then he sat down beside me like we were old friends. I laughed nervously and glanced around to see if anyone else was nearby, but the street was empty. I turned and started walking again, not expecting him to follow. But he did. He stayed right by my side, matching my pace with his ears perked up and his eyes darting around like he was on the lookout. It was comforting having him there. The streets didn't feel so lonely anymore. We walked in silence for a few minutes. I was almost starting to relax when I heard footsteps behind us. I glanced back and felt my stomach twist as I saw a group of men further down the sidewalk. They were walking slowly and talking in low voices, but their eyes were fixed on me. I tried to stay calm, picking up my pace, hoping they'd keep their distance, but they didn't. They started moving faster and closing the gap between us. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel the fear clawing at me, making it hard to think straight. But then the dog stopped and planted himself firmly between me and the men. He let out a low, menacing growl with his hackles rising. I'd never seen him look so fierce. It was like he'd transformed from a friendly stray into a guard dog ready to protect me at any cost. I kept walking and glanced over my shoulder every few seconds. The men had slowed down and were eyeing the dog warily. One of them muttered something to the others, and they kept their distance. But they didn't stop following. Every time they tried to get a little closer, the dog would growl with his teeth bared and his body tense. He didn't back down, didn't flinch. It was like he was daring them to try something. I felt a wave of relief every time he stepped in front of me, keeping that barrier between me and them. It was like he knew exactly what he was doing. We kept going like that, block after block. The men never got closer than a few steps, but they stayed just behind us with their eyes fixed on me. I could feel their presence like a weight on my back, but the dog's steady protective stance kept me moving forward. Finally, we reached my building. I fumbled with my keys and my hands were shaking as I desperately tried to get inside. The dog stood guard the entire time, watching the men with that same fierce expression. As soon as the door was unlocked, I turned to the dog, not sure what to say. I wanted to thank him, but I felt like words weren't enough. "Thank you," I whispered with my voice barely above a breath. He looked up at me, and his eyes softened as his tail gave a small wag. And then just like that, he turned and trotted off down the street, disappearing into the shadows as if he'd never been there. I watched him go and felt an ache in my chest. I'd only known him for a few blocks, but he'd been my protector, my guardian. I didn't even know where he'd come from or if I'd ever see him again. The next day I asked around the neighborhood and described the dog to anyone who'd listen, but no one had seen him. No one knew of any stray dogs that matched his description. It was like he'd been there just for me, appearing exactly when I needed him most. I still think about him sometimes, especially on those late walks home from work. I never saw him again, but I'll always remember him as my guardian angel. The dog who protected me when I needed it the most. I was on a solo backpacking trip in a national forest. I had my husky Shadow with me. Shadow was my constant companion on these trips, adventurous and alert, always sniffing out trails and keeping an eye on our surroundings. He loved the woods as much as I did. But on this particular trip, something felt different. We'd been hiking for a few days already, deeper into the forest than I'd ever been. I liked to push the limits, to see places few others had. But this time there was this nagging feeling, a prickling at the back of my neck like I was being watched. Shadow seemed tense too. His ears twitched at every little noise. He kept looking behind us, glancing back every few minutes like he was expecting to see something. The third night, I set up camp by a small river. The place was beautiful. A perfect spot, really. But the silence felt wrong. No birds, no insects, just the sound of the river. It felt unnatural. Shadow stayed close to me as I set up the tent. Usually he'd wander a bit, sniffing and exploring, but this time he didn't leave my side. As dusk settled, Shadow's tension only seemed to grow. He would stare into the tree line, his body rigid, his eyes sharp and unblinking. Every so often he'd let out a low growl. The sound made my skin crawl. I'd shine my flashlight into the darkness, trying to see what he was looking at, but there was never anything there, just the trees and shadows. After dinner, I tried to distract myself. I read for a while by the fire, occasionally petting Shadow to calm him. But he didn't calm down. He kept looking out into the forest, his eyes following something I couldn't see. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a bear passing through, but Shadow's behavior made it hard to believe that. Then, just after midnight, I heard it, faint, almost like a trick of the wind, laughter, low and muffled, coming from somewhere in the darkness. I froze, listening, my heart racing. Shadow's growl grew louder, a warning rumble deep in his chest. The laughter faded, and the forest was silent again. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was imagining things. A few minutes later, the laughter started again. This time louder, closer. It echoed through the trees, the sound unnatural and wrong, like someone trying to imitate laughter but not quite getting it right. Shadow was barking now, his fur bristling. His gaze locked on the darkness beyond the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees, hoping to see whatever was out there. But there was nothing, just the empty woods. My heart was pounding. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it had to be an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. I decided we couldn't stay there. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking, barely able to see what I was doing. But as I started to take down the tent, I found something on the ground near the fire. A small pile of rocks, arranged in a circle. It hadn't been there when I set up camp, and I was certain I hadn't made it. Shadow's barking grew frantic. I felt an overwhelming urge to get out of there, so I grabbed my pack and started down the trail. Shadow stayed right by my side. As we walked, the laughter started again. Faint at first, then louder, following us through the trees. We kept moving, but every few minutes, the laughter would start up again. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. It was as if whoever or whatever it was wanted us to know they were there. Every time the laughter echoed through the trees, Shadow would tense up. His ears would perk, his growl deep and threatening. After what felt like hours, we reached a small clearing. I stopped to catch my breath. My legs were shaking. Shadow stayed close, his gaze fixed on the trees. The laughter had stopped, but the silence was even worse. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Then I noticed something in the clearing, shapes carved into the bark of the trees, symbols I didn't recognize, circles and lines arranged in strange patterns. They looked old, worn down by time, but something about them felt fresh, like they'd been redrawn recently. Shadow growled again, his eyes fixed on one of the symbols. I didn't want to stay there any longer than I had to. We pressed on, moving quickly through the forest. The path seemed unfamiliar, twisting in ways it hadn't before. I started to feel disoriented. The trees seemed closer, the shadows darker. Then I heard it again, the laughter, closer than ever. It sounded right behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but there was nothing there. I pushed forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The laughter was relentless now, echoing all around us. Shadow was barking, his growls fierce and protective. I tried to keep my focus on the trail, but every step felt harder, like something was pulling me back. Then I saw it, a figure in the distance, just at the edge of the flashlight's reach, tall and thin, standing perfectly still, watching us. I couldn't make out any details, just a shadow in the darkness. I felt frozen, unable to move. But Shadow tugged on my sleeve, breaking me out of my trance. We ran, pushing through the underbrush, not looking back. We didn't stop until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Exhausted, we stumbled into another clearing, this one near the edge of the forest. The laughter had stopped. The silence felt normal again, like we'd finally escaped whatever had been stalking us. I looked down at Shadow, grateful he'd been there. His instincts had kept me moving, kept me alert, kept me from freezing up when fear had almost paralyzed me. I don't know what was in those woods, but I know it wasn't something I was meant to see, something that didn't want me there. I still think about that night often. Sometimes I have nightmares about the laughing. When Shadow whimpers in his sleep, I wonder if he's dreaming about it too. Neither of us will ever forget what happened in those woods. But I know that I wouldn't have made it out if it weren't for my friend Shadow. There was I live alone in a quiet neighborhood. Just me and my old German Shepherd Max. He's been with me for 13 years now and has always been my protector, but lately his age has been catching up to him. He mostly just lies around, too tired to do much more than get up for food and the occasional walk. His eyesight and hearing aren't what they used to be, and he sleeps deeply. He rarely even stirs at night. Honestly, I'd gotten used to seeing him as a companion more than a guard dog. Max used to be full of life. I remember when he would chase anything that moved. Shadows on the wall, leaves drifting in the wind, even his own tail. He was always alert and curious, always watching. It was strange to see that energy drain away as he got older. These days he seemed happiest curled up on his bed, drifting in and out of sleep. I had come to accept that he was no longer the fierce protector he used to be, but I loved him all the same. One night, I was woken up by a low, steady growl coming from the foot of my bed. I'd never heard him growl like that before. Not in years. I sat up, bleary-eyed, and saw Max standing there, tense and alert, staring at the bedroom door. His hackles were up and his gaze was sharper than I'd seen in years. It was like he was young again, on full alert. I could feel the tension radiating off him, like he was ready to leap into action. I tried to calm him down, figuring he'd just heard a raccoon outside, or maybe the wind had stirred him. I whispered, "Max, it's okay. Go back to sleep." But he didn't take his eyes off the door. That's when I heard it too. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway. Someone was in my house. My heart started pounding. I couldn't believe it. This was the kind of thing that happens in movies, not in my quiet little home. But Max didn't hesitate. He growled louder, his whole body tense, standing firm between me and the door. I could feel his determination, like he was telling me to stay back. The footsteps grew louder, closer, stopping just outside my bedroom. And then, without warning, Max let out a fierce bark and lunged at the door. His bark echoed through the house, deep and powerful, like he was drawing on the last reserves of his strength. I felt a surge of hope and fear all at once. The intruder must have heard him, must have realized there was no getting past a dog like Max. Within seconds, I heard the footsteps retreat, scrambling away, and then the sound of the back door slamming shut. I sat there in shock, clutching Max's fur as he calmed down, his breathing heavy and slow. I kept whispering thank you over and over, feeling an overwhelming gratitude for him. I don't know how long I stayed like that, listening to his heavy breaths and feeling my own heartbeat start to slow. The police arrived shortly after I called them, but by then, the intruder was long gone. They didn't find any fingerprints or signs of forced entry, but they told me I was lucky. They said Max had scared them off before anything worse could happen. I couldn't agree more. After that night, Max seemed to go back to his old tired self. He didn't have the energy he'd shown that night. Not even a hint of it. It was almost like he'd used up the last of his strength to protect me. Each day I saw him growing weaker, slower, his eyes cloudier. I started to realize that he'd been holding on for me, that maybe he had one last mission, to keep me safe. As the days passed, I noticed he was eating less, sleeping more. Sometimes he'd just look at me, with those old soulful eyes, and I could feel that he was saying goodbye in his own way. And then one quiet morning he lay down and didn't wake up. It broke my heart to lose him, but I couldn't help but feel grateful. His final act had been one of pure protection, a last display of loyalty and love. Max had always been there for me, right to the very end. I buried him in the backyard, in a sunny spot he loved, and even now, I can't help but feel that his spirit is still watching over me, my old friend and loyal guardian, gone but never forgotten. Sometimes at night I think I hear him. A soft bark in the distance, or the familiar sound of his paws on the floor. Maybe it's just my imagination, but maybe he's still here, watching over me, just like he always did. A few years ago, I decided to take a solo road trip. I wanted to disconnect from everything for a bit, just me, my car, and the open road. I didn't tell many people where I was going. I just packed my car, grabbed my German Shepherd Jake, and set off. Jake was my buddy, my protector. He'd been with me for years, always calm, always loyal. I didn't expect I'd be relying on him the way I ended up doing that night. I was passing through a remote area in the mountains, no towns for miles, the kind of place where the roads get narrower and the trees start closing in. The sun was setting, and I knew I needed to find a place to set up camp soon. I eventually found a small clearing just off the road, hidden among the trees. It felt quiet, too quiet maybe. But I brushed it off. I was used to camping alone, and I had Jake with me. As I set up the tent, Jake wandered around, sniffing the air. He was acting a little strange, his ears perked up, his head swiveling every so often like he was picking up on something I couldn't hear. I chalked it up to the new smells and sounds of the forest. But as the night went on, his restlessness grew. By the time I had a small fire going, Jake was sitting right next to me, his gaze fixed on the tree line. I tried to distract him, pet him, tell him it was all right. But he wouldn't relax. He just sat there, tense and alert, staring into the darkness. I followed his gaze, but all I saw were shadows. The forest seemed to close in around us, the kind of darkness that feels heavier than usual. After a while, I started to feel it too. That creeping sense of being watched. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. But Jake wasn't imagining it. He kept growling, low and steady, like he was warning whatever was out there to stay away. His fur was bristling, and his eyes never left the trees. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just out of sight. I froze, my heart pounding. Jake's growling grew louder. Whoever it was, they were close enough for Jake to pick up on them. But they weren't coming any closer. It was like they were circling us, staying just beyond the light of the fire. I kept my eyes on the darkness, straining to see who or what was out there. But nothing came into view, just the steady crunch of footsteps, slow, patient. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a deer maybe. But the footsteps were too heavy, too intentional. The footsteps stopped. The forest went silent. I sat there clutching Jake's fur, barely breathing. For a moment I thought maybe it was over. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A branch snapped, and I could hear the soft rustle of leaves, like someone trying to move quietly. I reached for a flashlight, my hands shaking. I pointed it toward the sound. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were trees, nothing else. But Jake didn't stop growling. His gaze stayed locked on something just beyond the flashlight's reach. Then, suddenly the footsteps moved again. This time they were moving away, faster. Almost as if whoever it was had finally decided to leave. I didn't feel any relief, though. Not yet. I sat by the fire with Jake for the rest of the night. Neither of us slept. He stayed close to me, never taking his eyes off the woods. When dawn finally broke, I packed up as quickly as I could. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there, that someone or something had been watching us the whole night. As we headed back to the main trail, I felt an overwhelming urge to look back one last time. Just to make sure, that's when I saw it. The ashes of our campfire. But something was there, a message scratched into the dirt, deep enough that it must have been done with a knife or some sharp object. Just one word. Stay. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to think about who had left it or what they meant. I just wanted to get out of those woods. Jake seemed to sense it too. He nudged me forward, urging me to leave, to get back to the car as quickly as possible. I haven't been back to that spot since, and I don't think I ever will. Jake's instincts saved us that night. He knew something was wrong, even if I didn't. I trusted him, and it might have been the only reason we made it out of those woods safely. I'm just grateful he was with me, my loyal friend, my protector. I've always loved being outdoors, so camping trips were a regular thing for me. I'd pack up my gear and take my golden retriever Daisy along for company. Daisy was the perfect camping companion, loyal, attentive. She had a way of picking up on things I couldn't. If I got lost in my own thoughts, she'd nudge me back to reality. We'd been on dozens of trips together, but there was one trip I'll never forget. One that still gives me chills every time I think about it. This time we went deep into the mountains, a spot far off the beaten path. The kind of place where you're guaranteed not to see another soul. I set up camp by a small creek. The only sounds were the trickling water and the occasional bird call. Daisy seemed to like the spot, her tail wagging as she explored the perimeter of the camp. By the time night fell, we'd settled in by the fire. Daisy lay contentedly at my feet. As the fire crackled, I decided to take a quick walk around to get a feel for the area. That's when I saw it, just a little way off the trail. Hidden between the trees was an old cabin. It was so overgrown I could have missed it entirely. The windows were cracked and dirty, the door slightly ajar. Something about it felt wrong, but I shrugged it off. I was curious and thought maybe I'd take a closer look. As I moved toward the cabin, Daisy's ears perked up. She stood and let out a low whine. I told her it was okay, but she wouldn't budge. She stayed rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the cabin. Her reaction stopped me in my tracks. Daisy was usually calm. She rarely barked or got spooked, even in unfamiliar places. This was different. Still, curiosity got the best of me. I took a few more steps forward, and that's when Daisy let out a sharp bark. The sound startled me. She was practically pleading with me to stay back. I stopped, feeling a prickle of unease run down my spine. The air felt heavier, colder, even though the night was mild. Daisy was usually right about things, so I turned back to camp. But before we left, I glanced over my shoulder at the cabin one last time. I couldn't see clearly in the dark, but I thought I caught a glimpse of something. A shadow in the doorway, watching me. Back at the campfire, I tried to shake off the feeling, but Daisy wouldn't settle. She kept pacing around, her eyes darting toward the direction of the cabin. I'd never seen her like this. I tried to comfort her, scratching her behind the ears, but she was tense, on edge. And if she was on edge, I knew I should be too. The night wore on. I climbed into my tent, Daisy lying beside me. Her body was still rigid, her ears perked up. Every little noise outside seemed to set her off. I tried to drift off to sleep, but Daisy's restlessness kept me awake. A little after midnight, just as I was finally dozing off, Daisy stood up suddenly. She let out another low growl. Her eyes were fixed on the tent door. Then I heard it, soft footsteps outside the tent. Slow and careful, I held my breath. Daisy's growl grew louder, a clear warning. I could feel her body trembling beside me. Whoever or whatever was outside paused right in front of the tent. For a few agonizing seconds, everything was silent. The only sound was Daisy's low rumble of a growl. Then the footsteps began to retreat, slowly at first, then quicker until they faded into the distance. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Daisy relaxed slightly, but her eyes stayed trained on the tent door, like she was ready for another threat. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Daisy didn't close her eyes once, and neither did I. At first light, I packed up camp as fast as I could. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there, that someone or something had been watching us the whole night. As we headed back to the main trail, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. Daisy stopped too, looking back at the trees. There, hanging on a low branch by the trail, was a small object tied with twine. I walked over and picked it up. It was a crude hand-carved figure, like a doll made from sticks and pieces of cloth. Daisy whimpered as I tossed it aside. I didn't want to think about what it meant or why it had been left there. I haven't been back to that spot since, and I don't think I ever will. Daisy's instincts saved us that night. She knew something was wrong, even if I didn't. I trusted her, and it might have been the only reason we made it out of those woods safely.